What is going on, gunfighters? Welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about gunfighting the right way with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. As always, I am your host, Michael Melito. First and foremost, I am a Christian. As number one, and everything that I do in this podcast is no different. Been blessed to be a professional gunfighter most of my adult life. If you listen regularly, you've heard the bio. I'll probably skip it today, as this is a mobile podcast. The inner tribe, the inner chat kind of knows this, but it'll be news to you guys. So I was traveling across country with the wife. I agreed to go back east to see her family for the winter. She really wanted to. She's got nieces and nephews and things, and wanted to go there for the winter. And since we work remotely and we're blessed to be able to move around, I agreed to do that. And we were traveling across country, and we got to Nebraska and started having issues. If you've known me in real life, you'll know that I love my Hummer H2 that I have had for years and years and years and been all over the country in. Well, she finally gave up on me in Nebraska. And so I was broken down truck in Nebraska with a wind chill of -9. For some people listening, that might not sound cold, but for me, that's pretty cold. And I have been days and days driving around looking for a replacement truck. By God's grace, we knew that the Hummer was getting up there, probably close to 300,000 miles. And we had, by God's grace, when we worked in the city and saved up some money for, some might say a rainy day, I'd say a cold day. So we had the money saved up, and we've been driving around looking for trucks. Maybe I'll do a whole Alpha Male podcast on looking at used vehicles. A lot of people may know more than me. I consider myself a decent shade tree mechanic, by no means a professional mechanic. But that's been my life. I think, by God's grace, finally, I have found the truck that we plan on buying tomorrow. And kind of has seemed like Groundhog Day here in Nebraska. Every day I think we're going to be leaving, and every day just we wake up again in Nebraska. But I think by God's grace we have found the truck, so praise God for that. If you care about the goings-on in the host's life. Anyway, I've been thinking about trucks and this engine versus that engine, and this miles versus this many years, and how does this engine sound, and is that enough rust or too much rust? And I want to talk about guns, right? Because I love talking about guns. That's one of the reasons I do Gunfighter Life, and to pass that knowledge on to you. Well, one of the things I really love guns for is more than just the black rifle tactical stuff. I like hunting guns and survival guns. And that's what I wanted to talk about with you today. The survival gun aspect in a classic survival gun guise. And that is the combination gun. So the combination gun, 2 different calibers, in general a rifle over shotgun, is what we're going to talk about today for survival. So buckle up, get ready for this edition of Gunfighter Life. So combo guns. You may be familiar with the combo guns. The one that I'm aware of that's being made now is the Savage, and it's most commonly in 22 long rifle over 410. And that's probably the most common one by far. So that's one I think we should start talking about. The 22 has long been a mainstay in the survival prepper community. The ammo is cheap, it's reliable. The ammo is cheap, it's easy to find, and it's very light per round compared to any other ammo. So the 22 long rifle has that going for it, right? With proper shot placement, you could take down a brontosaurus, some would have you believe. So it's been a mainstay in the prepper community for a long time. It is not the most reliable because it is rimfire. And without getting into being too technical, let's just all concede that rimfire is less reliable than center fire, right? There's no militaries issuing rimfire anything when there probably hasn't been since the 44 Henry in the very early days of metallic cartridges. For a reason, centerfire is more reliable and more dependable. So that's its big drawback. And it is underpowered, let's be honest. But for a survival situation, I think it has a lot of merit. Number one, because you can carry so much of it. I've said this before, but you can, in just a pair of pants with cargo pockets, probably carry 1,000 rounds of ammunition. You could dump 2 proper full-size bricks, which are harder to find than they used to be. A lot of people are making like smaller bricks, like 300. But 2 proper full 500 round bricks you could probably dump into each cargo pocket, and you could carry 1,000 rounds in your pants. You can't do that with any other round. And the 410, I've done a whole episode on the 410. I think the 410 is an awesome cartridge. It's not nearly as light as a lot of cartridges, but it is by far the lightest weight shotgun cartridge, right? So it has that going for it. The 410 is an awesome round. I love it. That was my first gun that I ever had proper firearm and hunted with, was a 410 bolt action, which I was very blessed to hand down to a nephew that I'm very proud of. But I grew up hunting with that thing. Hunted deer with it, hunted duck with it, hunted squirrel with it, and rabbit with it, and who knows what else with it. And the 410, it is a very capable round inside its parameters. If you get a proper slug, a good Bernecki style slug, it is decent on deer, I'd say out to 50 yards. If you look at its energy, it's a decent deer round. Now some places or some people might disagree with that, but I think that it's fine for deer. Also, because of its diameter, you can stack triple-aught buck in there, and you can get like, I think, 4 or 5 triple-aught buck in a buckshot cartridge, which is a decent defensive round, and it's a decent deer round at very close range. Now, I would consider the 20 gauge and the 12 gauge shotgun lethal out to 150 meters, and that really mostly depends on your sighting apparatus. The killing capability of a 12 gauge or even 20 gauge slug far exceeds, in general, the ability to hit your target accurately. If you can hit it in the vitals with a slug, in general, the ballistics capabilities of that round are a moot point. It's capable if you can hit it. The 410 I would consider capable out to about 50 yards rather. If I stutter a little bit, hope you'll forgive me, because I am driving and I have seemingly been driving for quite a long time. But I think I would consider, with the right slug, a good Bernecki style slug. If I had the proper dope on my combo gun and I was confident I could hit the target, I would be confident that I could take down a deer-sized target at 50 meters with a good Bernecki style slug. So you have that, and let's be honest, the vast majority of a deer, no matter what gun magazines today and stuff will have you believe, a lot of them are taken inside of 50 yards. And I would say that if I was going to take a deer with a 22, I would like to keep it inside that same distance. So that's kind of your parameters for that, and that combination gives you the ability to carry the most ammo. So that's your classic, or that's kind of your go-to combo gun. The next one, and I think they still make it, they make that same Savage in the 22 Magnum 410. Now, 22 Magnum is an interesting cartridge. It has perhaps the best power to weight ratio of any round. It does not weigh much more than the 22 long rifle, because it just has extra powder, which weighs very little, and extra brass case, which weighs very little compared to the size of the weight of the projectile. So power to weight ratio, it may be the number one place in power to weight ratio. You get a lot more power than the 22 long rifle, and you don't get a lot more weight. That being said, I don't think it's as good as the 22 long rifle, and let me explain why. For everything that you gain, and you do gain some things in the 22 Magnum, you gave something up. You give up the commonality of ammo. It's not an uncommon round, but it's far less common I don't know how many, like 10 to 1, 20 to 1, but it's far less common round per round than 22 long rifle. It's also more expensive, which is not a big deal if you're talking about a survival situation. It's not prohibitively expensive. However, here's my big rub with the 22 Magnum over the 22 long rifle. The reason I want a 22 long rifle or 22 Magnum is for hunting, right? It's to put meat on the table. And the 22 Magnum is a fine varmint round. It is a fine and really good and much better for what I would consider large, small game. Raccoon, possum, beaver, coyote. Any of those things, it's going to be better than a 22 long rifle. But it's worse, not for killing, but for something I want to eat on true small game, right? A dove. I don't want to shoot a dove with a 22 Magnum. It's going to do far more damage. And that's the whole point. If it's a survival situation, I'm not shooting it to keep it out of my bird feeder, right? I'm shooting it because I want to eat it. And if I want to eat it, I don't want all that damage that comes with that high velocity varmint round. So I think for that, it's not as good an all-around choice. It might be a better choice for you if you're primarily getting an over-under combo gun for pest control or for something like that. Then I'd say that's fine, but I think you give up more than you gain going to the 22 Magnum. That being said, it's a good round. I think it's a good varmint hunting round. I just don't think it's as versatile or as good a choice for survival as the 22 long rifle is. It would have been really cool, without getting too technical, if you look at a 22 long rifle, it's kind of a holdover from a bygone era. It has a ballooned head cartridge with a heel on it, and the case is crimped into that bullet, meaning that basically the case and the bullet are the same diameter. Most modern bullets, including the 22 Magnum, has a step in so basically the bullet goes inside the metallic cartridge, which is how the vast majority of almost all other cartridges are today. Because of that, even in a single shot rifle, you generally cannot shoot a 22 Magnum and a 22 long rifle. If they had just made it just like the 22 long rifle but longer, then you could. I know some revolvers you can shoot, they have different cylinders, but in a rifle you can't shoot safely a 22 long rifle and a 22 Magnum. It had been cool if they had designed the 22 Magnum that way. So yeah, I've got a single shot 22 Magnum, but I could also shoot 22 long rifles in it. That would have been cool, but that's not the case. Perhaps one day they will make a 22 super long rifle, or call it something else. So the Super Maxi Magnum, something that's not confusing so people won't put in the wrong gun and blow themselves up, which is probably why they did that in the first place. But if you could, that would be a great option. However, I do think the original M6 survival rifles have another intriguing choice, and that is the 22 Hornet. So let's talk about that in a classic combo gun, because I think it may have been one of the first offerings in the M6. If you don't know, it's like a downed pilot Air Force survival rifle for just this reason, right? Escape and evasion and meat on the table. It wasn't meant to be a, battlefield rifle. It was meant for pilot goes down, he's now in a survival, food procurement, escape and evasion scenario. The 22 Hornet. A lot of people overlook this because there's so many higher velocity rounds like the 223 or many other, the 22 250 or something like that. But as I alluded to in the 22 mag versus 22 long rifle part, more is not always better. What's really cool about the 22 Hornet is it is a center fire round. I would say the 22 Hornet would be a fine choice, caveat, if you reload. If you reload, you could reload it down to 22 long rifle or thereabouts capability. And with proper bullet selection, which is vitally important, you could shoot that truly small game, that dove, that, Gamble's quail, wherever you're at in the country, that bobwhite quail, that robin. Don't think that you wouldn't get so hungry that you wouldn't love to eat a robin. My best friend and I, when we were younger, I I don't know if I've ever told this story before, but I'm tired, so why not? We overturned our canoe, got soaking wet, and it was raining, and I was able to harvest a goose, and we ate the goose raw because we could not get the fire going well enough to cook it in the rain. So don't think that you can't get so hungry that you'll eat something like that, because it's very, very possible. The 22 Hornet could be quite flexible, unlike the 22 Magnum, where you're basically limited to store-bought factory ammunition. If you reload, not only can you reload very cheap, because it's a fairly cheap and easy cartridge to reload for, you could go from the full power 22 Hornet, which is quite a bit more powerful than even the 22 Magnum. It's quite a big step up from the 22 Magnum. You could also step it down so you're not blowing it up, and you could just take some nail polish and paint the back of your cartridges to know which is which. And if you know your dope and everything, and if you're going to keep your shot, let's say on a dove, to inside 10 yards, it's basically a point-and-click operation. And you just save your full-powered loads for if you see that thing that's farther away or that bigger animal that you want to take. If you wanted to take this is for survival purposes, not sporting purposes, right? This would be highly illegal. So unless your life depends on it, I wouldn't do this. But if your life depended on you getting food or not, then, something like a turkey, a full-powered, 22 Hornet would be a far better choice. So I think the 22 Hornet is a good choice if you reload. So I'm going to pause this and pick up the next section. We'll talk about some other cool choices and what perhaps I might want to choose if I got to pick my ultimate combo gun. Now let's talk about Pick Your Own Adventure. Remember those old books, Pick Your Own Adventure books? How about Pick Your Own Adventure calibers for your combo gun? Now, Savage, back in the day, the old, not the new one that they make, but they made an old wood and steel combo gun, and they made it in a lot of different calibers. And I'm not going to pretend to know all the calibers. You can go look that up, but they made a lot of different combinations. Also, Baika, if I'm saying that right, a Russian manufacturer, made a lot of really cool combinations in the combo gun. And again, I'm not going to try and remember or look up what all those are. That might be a whole episode in and of itself. But if you could pick your own adventure, if you were decided the combo gun is the way I want to go for survival, what would you choose? Well, I tell you what I would choose, what my top picks would be and why. So let's talk about that. First, I'm going to start out with the shotgun gauges, because there's only really 3 to consider, and that's going to be a lot quicker to talk about. So we'll talk about the shotgun, and then we'll talk about the rifle calibers that you might want on top of that. So, the shotgun gauges. The classic argument of 12 versus 20. Okay, I'm going to be completely honest with you on this. I think it's 50-50. I think it's perfectly even match, right? If you were betting odds on a fight between the two, I think it would be totally even. I think the odds would be totally even. And here's why. Is 12 gauge ammunition more widely produced? Yes, but a lot more people own it. So when it's hard to get ammo, then it dries up about the same rate. If you can find 12 gauge, you're probably likely to find 20 gauge. It's not like when ammo dries up, which it has done quite a bit recently, not right now, but in recent history, you're probably just as likely to find 12 gauge as 20 gauge. 12 gauge is more powerful, but 20 gauge is smaller and lighter by a little bit. And unless you're talking about big coastal brown bears in Alaska, pretty much anything you want to kill, you can kill with either gauge. It's not like I would feel undergunned shooting a white-tailed deer with a 20 gauge Foster slug versus a 12 gauge Foster slug, right? The difference is really academic. So I think you're fine either way. I don't think there's a clear winner there. Do you want, the 12 gauge because it's more powerful? Do you want the 20 gauge because you can carry more ammo? Do you want the 12 gauge or the 20 gauge? Mostly because you own a lot of that caliber. And that's the reason I would probably go with the 12 if I was going with one of those two. And it's not because I think it's a better choice, it's just because I have more printer ink for it, right? I have a lot more 12 gauge ammo in a lot different configurations than I have for the 20 gauge. I do own a 20 gauge, and it is nice to go out for upland bird hunting and stuff, but I don't have anywhere near the amount for that I do with a 12 gauge. So I'd probably lean towards the 12. I would not fault you for going towards the 20. And a lot of these combos, which we'll talk about, I would pick the 410. I would still pick the old 410, the old school little serial killer, the little shotgun gauge that can. Because we talked about it already, but you lose a little bit of range, but you can still take deer-sized game, and plenty of deer have gone to the freezer with the 410 triple aught buck, I would assume, and also with a good Bernecki style 410 slug. That's a decent medium-sized game at reasonable ranges with proper shot placement. I'd certainly rather have that than a 22. So, and that ammo is a lot lighter. You do, get a little bit lighter ammo with a 20 gauge, but it's a lot lighter and smaller for a 2.5 inch shell 410 than it is for a standard box of 20 gauge. So you get a little bit lighter ammo with the 20 over the 12, but you get a lot lighter ammo and a lot smaller ammo, which if you're packing it on your back, it's not just weight, it's how much can you carry as far as volume goes. So the 410 is still, in a lot of these combos, my top pick. Don't think that you always need more power. We talked about that dove or that quail, right? Or that robin, or whatever. We're not talking about trying to shoot them out of the air. In that case, yeah, a 20 gauge is going to give you an advantage, or a 12 gauge is going to give you an advantage. But if you're waiting for it to land because you don't want to waste ammo, if you can kill it with the 20 gauge or the 12 gauge, you can probably still kill it just as dead with a couple of pellets from a 410. The pellets from that 410 or the 20 gauge or the 12 gauge, and it depends on the load, but if you look at the data, they're pretty much all going the same velocity. So if 1 or 2 pellets of 7.5 shot is going to kill that animal, why carry around the extra weight of the 12 gauge if you can kill it with the 410? So for a lot of these combos, I'd still lean towards the 410. Alright, so there's that on the shotgun ammo. Let's talk about the rifle, because that's a lot more complex. There's a lot more options. So I'll kind of give you some of the top picks. The 223, right? The 223, talking about commonality of ammo, it's probably the most common centerfire rifle caliber. So it's got that going for it. It is not a great deer-sized cartridge, but with proper ammo, let's say a 62 grain or a 64 grain soft point, or a solid copper round, or something like that, it's not a horrible deer round. The terminal ballistics and the great selection of bullet construction for the 223, 5.56, right? I'm using those interchangeably. I would get it chambered in 5.56 so I can shoot both, obviously, or 223 wild. But it is an acceptable, I'll call it an acceptable, I could stomach it as a deer round, right? And it's going to do fine on a lot of those other things in a survival situation where I have to take this animal or I'm going to die, right? Not a sporting situation. A turkey, a goose, a rough grouse, a spruce grouse, something like that. I would choose a different round so I didn't tear up all my meat. And again, going back to reloading, I would probably do a trail boss load where I could load it way down, or I would just shoot it with the shotgun. But the 223, of all the centerfire rounds that are common, because 22 Hornet is not common, you can carry a lot of that ammo, right? That's the reason that NATO went to it over the 7.62, the 308, right? Because you can carry a lot more ammo. So do you want to have 200 rounds of 223 5.56, or do you want to have 100 rounds of 308? So the 223 is a viable choice and a viable option, and we obviously know it's capable for defense. Now, I think it's less capable in this guise than in a true, battlefield rifle, because you get one shot. So if I get one shot with the rifle before I have to reload, I don't want that to be a 223. So it's a decent option, but I wouldn't probably put it in my top 5 for that reason, right? It's not a great deer hunting cartridge, and it's a great defense cartridge in a semi-automatic. It's not a great defensive cartridge in a single shot. If I only get one shot, my recoil recovery time is kind of a moot point because I have to reload anyway, right? So why not go more power? So that leads me to the next obvious choice to talk about. And that next obvious choice is going to be your 7.62 NATO or your 308. It's a good choice. It is a solid deer round. Nobody's going to argue with its effectiveness on deer. It's a fine elk round if you use proper bullet selection, a nozzler partition. Certainly, I'm sure many moose and things like that have been taken with it. Pretty much any medium to large game, you're good to go with a 308. It has been putting stuff in the freezer for well over 50 years. Nobody argues with its effectiveness. It's heavy, but it's not crazy heavy. I mean, it's not a heavy round. With proper bullet selection, it would be fine. Also, if I had to get in a duel and you gave me the choice, I would certainly take one shot of 7.62 NATO over one round of the 223. If it's 1-for-1, because 223 is not a bad defensive round, but it's not known for having the best one-shot stop capability, right? The 7.62 is far better at that, and you're only getting one shot before you reload. So if I were choosing, I would definitely go for this. I'm not saying carte blanche, but for this, I would go the 7.62 route over the 223 route, right? So there is that. Also, since you're dealing with a single shot, you're not dealing with long action versus short action. You're singly loading these. Also, a 30-06 is a great option. I think 30-06 is a more flexible round than the 308, and it's still very, very, very common. Depending on what part of the country you're in, you might have better odds finding 30-06 than you will 308. In a lot of other parts of the country, you're probably easier to find 308. That being said, the 30-06 is a really good choice for this. It is more flexible. It handles heavier bullets better, right? So I think for this, it would be a legit choice. You're not dealing with like bolt actions where you have a long action versus a short action. You're dropping the rounds into the chamber, into the barrel. So that the length of the cartridge is basically a moot point. The amount of ammo you're going to be carrying, you're not talking about NATO shipments and shipping containers full of ammo. The difference in weight between 30-06 and 308 for you carrying it is probably not noticeable. So it would be a great choice for this. Now let's talk about what would probably be, because this came out of a Patreon chat. We were talking about this the other day. I posed this question to them, and then I gave my top pick. I think, for me, I would pick the 30-30, right? I would pick the 30-30 because if you're doing a shotgun over rifle, you're probably doing iron sights, maybe a red dot. But for this, probably an iron sights or a 1X of some kind, maybe a scout scope. A Vortex Spitfire might be good because it has a reticle. It takes a battery, but it works fine without a battery. And I would have backup iron sights. So for that, you're limited by your sighting apparatus. You're probably not with the kind of iron sights you'd want. I'm not talking about precision peep sights, right? Because if you want to shoot fast with your shotgun, you don't want precision peep sights. You probably want an open leaf sight. For the kind of sights you're going to have, that's going to be the limitation on your range. And I think 30-30 is a fine round out to 200 yards. If you get your max point blank range down right, you would have no problem with the 30-30 out to 200 yards. It is a very common round. It does fine with that. It is a good choice. That would probably be my top pick. The fact that most of the rounds do not have Spitzer bullets doesn't matter because you're limited primarily by your sighting apparatus. So it doesn't matter that the to me, it wouldn't matter that the 308 or the 30-06 are better killers at 400 meters, right? Because I'm not going to shoot this thing at 400 meters because my sighting apparatus is going to limit me to probably 200 meters and in. So for that, I think the 30-30 would be my top pick. It does really well in those kind of ranges. It would do really well in that kind of combo gun. It's a classic rimmed cartridge, so it's kind of designed to be dropped into a rifle chamber like that, right? It's a good cartridge. It's very, very common. Not probably as common nowadays as a 308, 30-06, but it would be a fine choice. It'd probably be the way that I would go. I'd probably go 30-30, and I'd probably do that over a 410. If it was any kind of medium game or large game, I would use a 30-30, and I would use the 410 for anything small game or as a backup shot if I needed it. So I think that would be my combo choice. I would go 30-30 over 410. I think that would be a fantastic choice. I would probably do irons, just regular iron sights, just a basic leaf sight. And I might do, like I talked about, that Vortex Spitfire, maybe a scout scope. I've never actually, I don't know if you could shoot a shotgun effectively fast enough with a scout scope. I don't really have any experience with that, but it wouldn't be a bad choice. If you were going to do a magnified scout scope and the shotgun, because again, you probably in a survival situation aren't going to worry too much about shooting, clay pigeons out of the air with your shotgun. That's not what you're doing. So maybe if I was going the scout scope route with a 2.5 or something like that, and if it was this kind of rifle, I'd probably go with a fixed power scope. You might want to lean towards the 308 or the 30-06, because if you're going to go magnified optic, you might squeeze a little bit more range out. That being said, I don't think so. I think 200 yards and in, and let's be real, most deer are shot inside of 200 yards. So I think that will be my top choice. You are welcome to disagree. Let's talk about the runners-up. If I was going to go the 223 route, I would definitely go 12 gauge, because 223 is not that powerful for one shot, so I'd want my shotgun barrel to be a 12 gauge. So I would probably go 223 and 12 gauge, right? Because if I want a good defensive round up close and I get one shot, I want that 12 gauge double up buck or that 12 gauge number 4 buck is my preferred load. So I'd much rather have that. I don't want the 223 and 410, right? Because I'm kind of underpowered on both. And so that would be my pick for that. And if I was going to go the 308 or the 30-06 route, I would still go with the 410. Because the 410 is going to be fine on all the small game. And if it's medium to large game, then I've got my 308 and my 30-06. So that's my rationale for those combinations. Okay, so let's talk about two more things, I think. One would be the Dragoon combo gun. And this would be limited application, but if you lived in that coastal brown bear part of Alaska or the interior U.S., Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, where grizzlies are a real possibility, and just where the animals tend to be bigger. You have big, large megafauna, moose and elk and bison. Or perhaps, let us not forget our Canadian friends up there, the Great White North with maybe Alberta in this area. And what about all the listeners in Africa? I do see on my demographics that there are listeners from Africa. If you are in a place with those kind of animals, a Dragoon, a heavy cavalry version of this combo gun. And I think, really, for me, if I'm going to go the Dragoon route for this, I would go 375 H&H. It's big enough to kill anything. And it is an old school cartridge, meaning it headspaces on the rim. It's a rimmed cartridge. It's highly tapered, which for a lot of modern applications is not desirable. But for this, for a single shot, or a single shot in this caliber break open gun, that's kind of what that caliber, the 375 H&H, was designed for. It's big enough to kill anything without being so big that it's more than you need. I think the 375 would be awesome. I picked that one. I think it's the most common here in the U.S. That being said, if I lived in Africa, I do believe maybe the 9.3 over there would be comparable and maybe more common. So I'd go with whichever one of those two was more common. I think they'd both be a fine fit for this. And then if I was over there and I had the Dragoon version of this, I'd probably go 12 or 20 gauge. Because if I did have a charging Gridley and I only had 2 shots, I would, if it was in that kind of situation, I'd like for one of them to be a 12 gauge or a 20 gauge slug. Anyway, that's my Dragoon pick. And then I have one more that might be fun, a Wildcat pick. If you don't know, a Wildcat is a cartridge that begins its life, and maybe at the time of it still being a Wildcat, it's not really been commercially adopted. And many of the great cartridges that we have today are Wildcats. The Wildcat I would pick for, not the Dragoon version, but the regular version of this would be the 22 Creedmoor. I am really surprised the 22 Creedmoor has not gained more credence in the shooting community. I think it has a lot of merit. It's designed to shoot really long, high BC bullets in the 22 caliber range. You're talking 77, 88, 90 grain bullets at respectable velocities. If I were doing this when I was wildcatting it, then I would probably also be choosing the barrel and the twist rate, and I would choose a 1 and 8. And that should theoretically let me stabilize like the 88 grain, the 77 grain, all the way down to like the 55 grain. And I think that would be a sweet spot for this round. I said that I think that that the 223 is a deer cartridge. I don't think it's a good deer cartridge. I think it's an acceptable, I could stomach it. I think the 22 Creedmoor is a fine deer-sized cartridge. I wouldn't go much bigger than that, but I think 22 Creedmoor is a much better medium-sized game cartridge. And again, if I'm hand-loading, I can load it way down and take all manner of game and load it up. And since it's shooting 22 caliber projectiles, it has that really good power-to-weight ratio. Perhaps not as high if you were to mark it as the 22 Magnum, but the 22 Creedmoor would certainly have a very high power-to-weight ratio. If I'm carrying a lot of it, I would like to have that round, and I'd probably pair that with a 20 gauge or a 12 gauge. Because if something's up close and personal and I want a lot of power, I would want the option of a 12 gauge round. Anyway, those are my picks for my top combo guns. I'd love to know what your picks are for the top combo guns. You can go ahead and leave a comment, or you can get a hold of me at goodshepherdtraining.com. Thanks, and have a blessed day.